for the Zoom to kick on here, Jim. All right, welcome to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. It is February 15th, Wednesday morning, and we're here with the Executive Director of the Vermont Democratic Party, and I've asked Jim to give us his feedback on our draft miscellaneous elections bill. So Jim, welcome to the committee, and please introduce yourself for the record and tell us what you think.
Yes, thank you for having me. Good morning to the members of the Government Operations and Military Affairs Committee. I'm Jim Dandino. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Democratic Party. And we work to engage Vermonters in the political process at every level, from municipal town committees all the way through federal elections. We have party members holding leadership positions in about half the towns in the state, in cities and towns ranging from Burlington to Maidstone, with robust, active party organizations in every county. You have my written testimony in your files, and I know how much everybody hates when people read their written testimony that they've submitted. So I am just going to hit a couple of the high points. These are the Vermont Democratic Party's thoughts on the proposed elections bill. With regard to the sore loser law, big picture stuff, this bill does a good job of streamlining information for voters. The sore loser law, the independent candidate filing deadline alignment, and the cross nominations all help provide clearer, more concise information to voters. Party affiliation is shorthand for folks. People have a lot of stuff going on in their lives. They're very busy. Oftentimes, when you have a crowded election like we did in 2022 with a lot going on, people don't have the bandwidth to find out all of the information that they might like to know about the candidates for office. So all of these pieces help provide clearer information to voters. The sore loser law, giving folks one bite at the apple, helps narrow that information down. People who run in a primary and lose have already had the will of the voters expressed. And we have open primaries. It's very easy to participate in elections at every phase of the process for Vermonters. And I think when the will of the voters is expressed in the primary, to give folks who lose those primaries the opportunity to run again under a different party line helps kind of muddy the water in that information that's provided to voters. They can say, why is this person still on as a Republican? I already voted against them as a Democrat. So limiting it to one shot in an election really helps kind of narrow that focus for folks with limited bandwidth for gathering information. Aligning the independent candidate filing deadline with the major party candidate filing deadline is another way of making sure that voters have ample time to gather information about the candidates that are running for office. It also makes it, quite frankly, for us, it makes it easier to plan. It makes it easier to understand. There are still ample opportunities to fill vacant spots on the ballot. Parties have the ability to nominate. The candidates have the opportunity to run as write-in candidates for empty ballot lines after the filing deadline. And it is not unheard of it's actually fairly common for candidates to run write-in campaigns in the primary and win that party line. And to kind of jump ahead in the bill, I do really appreciate the section about filing a consent of candidacy form 2 weeks before the election if you are a serious write-in candidate. If you are a serious write-in candidate who is running for an open ballot line, you can't throw that together in 2 weeks for a primary and have a realistic expectation of getting enough votes to qualify anyway. And if you are a serious candidate running a write-in in a contested general election, then if you are not running more than 2 weeks ahead of time, you are not going to win that general election, right? If you are running in a contested race as a write-in candidate and you have a serious expectation of winning, that is not something that you can throw together a week before election day when, quite frankly, people have already been voting for 5 weeks before that, right? So, my sarcasm in the written testimony aside, I do really hate having to scroll through 85 columns on the Excel spreadsheet to collect the results after the election. But realistically speaking, this is an undue burden on town clerks to have to list every single Donald Duck vote that was cast. And it doesn't make it any easier for us.
Literally, sometimes folks voting for Donald Duck.
Yes, constantly. And it's not, and I heard yesterday's testimony, some folks were saying that it's disrespectful to the will of the voters to not count every single Donald Duck voter. I think the will of the voter is adequately expressed by casting a write-in ballot when there is no write-in candidate. And we don't need to force our clerks to tally up every single Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck vote in the election. On the self-certification and the submission of the town and county leadership that have organized, that is another piece of information that is helpful for us and helpful for voters. We are entering into the delegate selection process. I've been neck deep in planning for delegate selection for the 2024 National Nominating Convention. And there's a piece in there that says that we need to ensure that bona fide Democrats are the delegates that we send to the National Party Convention. And right now, and even with this section implemented into law, it is still an act of faith on the party's part, naming people as bona fide Democrats as eligible for those delegate roles. But it is another data point. If someone was a Republican town chair in 2023 and they run to be a Joe Biden delegate at the Democratic National Convention, as it currently stands, unless that person is identifying themselves publicly as a Republican town chair, we have no way of discovering that they are a member of the Republican Party, and they could feasibly get elected to the National Convention as a delegate. And this applies for the Republicans as well. There is no way of knowing if someone was the chair of the Brandon Democrats who then decides to run to be a Haley delegate, right? This would provide public information, and I'm comfortable with tweaks to the level of information that is provided to the Secretary of State's office. If there is a privacy concern, then town and name is probably more than enough for us to publicly identify the person. Same goes for the cross-nomination process. This, again, streamlining the information available to voters. I want to just use an example. The abortion bill that the House passed last week, I believe, protecting reproductive health providers and people seeking reproductive care in Vermont. That bill passed 8-4 out of committee, I believe. And I got a text message from a reporter saying, "What's the deal with this guy who voted against it? Why is one of your people voting against it?" And I looked, and that person was a Republican and had won the nomination on a write-in on the Democratic line and was listed as RD. And if a reporter doesn't know this, then we can't reasonably expect the general public, who is not professionally invested in understanding who everybody in this building is and how they vote and what their political affiliations are. It's not reasonable to expect regular voters to understand that as well. So limiting cross-nomination, I think, helps streamline that information. I also think that the changes to the write-in statute that are proposed here might also help solve some of that problem. So I don't want to lean too heavily on any one aspect of it. My only flag on the demographic information piece is that we have unfortunately seen several representatives over the last several years subject to some pretty vicious harassment, and self-identification and not mandating it helps to limit the potential for harassment. But there is, I think, when you provide all of this information and create a culture of expectation around filing this information about yourself as a candidate, there's a certain element of peer pressure that will push everybody to feel like they need to provide that. And I am concerned with providing a bus map for harassers, really. If there's a way to decouple personally identifiable information from the demographic statistics, I think we would be wholeheartedly supportive of that. As of right now, it's something that we have some reservations about, just as a matter of protecting the folks that are willing to put themselves forward as candidates.
Do you think, as a matter of policy, Jim, on that note, that you feel better about the way the demographic information was kind of made available if, just as a matter of policy, if the Secretary of State's office would make it available to, the press and people, but they didn't publish it, just that there was that one layer where, your average troll on Facebook, had to go through one step in order to get access to all of the information.
I think it's worth figuring out how to add that extra step to make it harder for the Facebook trolls to find those people. I'm not, you guys are the experts. You guys are the professionals here. So I will defer to the committee's judgment. I'll defer to the committee's judgment on the actual mechanism for implementation. But even if it's just an aggregation, right? If the Secretary of State's office can issue totals of the self-reporting without publishing who's what, who's a member of which demographic group, I think makes it a little bit harder for folks to track down who these people are.
Are you done?
Yeah, good. You guys, put it down.
No, thank you. Jim, thanks for the information and the feedback and the insight. I have a question about fusion candidates. Do you know how many candidates ran as fusions, as hybrids in the last cycle? Whether it's a PD, DP, RD?
Not off the top of my head.
I'm just curious about how prevalent it is as a percentage of people who identify with one party affiliation.
I can dig that out. I don't have that number.
Oh, great. Yeah. If you could shoot that to us, that'd be wonderful. I'd love to see it just visually.
Yep.
I wanted to go back to the town and county and state committee members, that reporting.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, it's my understanding that it's possible for somebody to be a committee member of multiple town parties, because we don't really know who those folks are.
Yes. If the Heinsberg Dems, Progs, and Republicans all caucus on separate days, it is possible for someone to be a member of all three, so for someone to caucus with all three committees. The only real limitation is time and space.
Your counterpart from the Republican Party yesterday had testified to the effect that folks, kind of want to be able to volunteer and be on these volunteer committees anonymously. And I'm trying to kind of understand the virtue of, if you're somebody who goes and wants to join the committee and caucus at the town level, of keeping that person's at least name in town. I like the idea maybe of not publishing their address, but at least allowing the parties to see these are our committee members, so that there isn't that sort of, I don't know that I would want to have somebody who is organizing in another party come over to my party caucus as well and want to participate.
Right. I think that in an ideal situation, the town party is a part of that town's civic life, right? They are not, it's not just about elections. It's about providing, building community. It's about making space for folks with shared values to discuss those values and to develop political power. And I think part of that is identifying who you are, right? Part of that is standing up for your beliefs and your values. And I have a tough time imagining folks who would be willing to put themselves out there and do the work of organizing a town committee, then wanting to remain anonymous, right? Because what's the point? If you're a member of the Arlington Democratic Committee, you're doing that because you care about democratic policies and democratic values, and you want to help further those policy goals in Arlington. Not telling people that you're a part of that committee. I mean, it's not even like there's prestige involved in being a member of the town committee, right? What do you get from that besides the ability to talk to your friends and neighbors about what you care about?
Yeah, I've been baffled by the idea that there's virtue in the anonymity of the party committee members. but that assertion.
I mean, it does kind of tie back to the issue of harassment for candidates from historically marginalized backgrounds, right? There are certainly people who will harass folks based on their party affiliation, but decoupling decoupling personal information from that, right? If Jim Dandino is listed as a member of the Underhill Dems, there's an extra step involved in figuring out where I live and, finding where my family is to go harass them. But there's also value in me communicating that I am a member of the town Democratic Party to friends and to like-minded people around the state.
Thank you. Sure.
So did you review yesterday's testimony from the other?
I watched. I did. I watched.
So Paul Dame from the GOP put this thought on the table about a vetting process in the primaries for the parties where they could sort of identify a preferred candidate, I guess.
Okay.
And then designate that individual or individuals with some kind of marker of sorts on the ballot. I was just curious what your thoughts on that concept might be.
I feel like what the Republican chair was asking for is something that is already available to parties. There is nothing precluding the Vermont Democratic State Committee from passing a resolution saying that Representative Matt Byron does not represent the values of the Vermont Democratic Party and strongly encouraging Democrats voting in a primary to vote against him. For example, you're a good Democrat. We're not going to never do that to you.
For the sake of
We'd never do that to you.
Yes.
But like there's nothing precluding the state party from doing that already. What I think Paul is asking for is a way to mark them on the ballot, which is micromanaging. To just kind of stop beating around the bush, in Liam Madden's case, the Republican State Committee could have said, this person is not a Republican, this person does not represent us, and it is the will of the Vermont State Republican Party that Liam Madden not be elected. We can't do anything to prevent him from getting your votes in our primary, but we want to communicate to our folks, to partisan Republicans voting in this primary, that he is not who we would choose. And, you could do this a lot of different ways. You don't have to do it as a resolution by the state committee. You can do it by having state committee members publicly endorse at a press conference, right? And something like that, if you're concerned about communicating that effectively to voters, a party state committee holding a press conference to de-endorse a potential candidate in their primary is news, right? That is statewide news. There is no way that does not get, heavy coverage. So I think I think that Paul's suggestion is a little bit too much and already kind of available to people, to state parties.
So one of the inherent things that we've been discussing as we've been looking at this bill, and we really just yesterday started to take testimony on it. We put it on the table and discussed some of the ideas in it the previous week, but there's an inherent tension in Vermont's primaries between having them be totally open, both to the candidates and to the voters, to sort of say, this year I'm filing as a Democrat if I'm a candidate, or I'm filing as a Republican, I'm voting on the Democratic ballot this primary year, the progressive the next, that it leads to a situation where candidates' connection to the activists, the parties, their platform, their values, if a party doesn't happen to run a candidate that's endorsed, let's say, by party activists, by the party committees, et cetera, we don't really have an endorsement process. There's nothing stopping. I guess what I'm hearing you say is there's nothing stopping the county, local, or state parties from endorsing a candidate. So, for instance, if there was no Democrat running on their line and there was a progressive that shared a lot of values in common, there's nothing stopping, even if we pass this bill, the Vermont Democratic Party from saying that independent or that progressive or even that Republican is the Democratic endorsed person, even if they only have one name on the ballot or one party endorsement on the ballot.
Yeah, there's nothing preventing parties from publicly supporting who they want to support. And, logistically speaking, it's in the party's best interest to kind of have a light touch in those circumstances because you have to work with everybody after they get elected. So you don't want to alienate anybody by endorsing somebody that is going to come back to bite you. But there is, in the case of somebody who is, the kind of person who will give his 2-year-old $5,000 to donate to his campaign, I feel like that's a circumstance where, the party has a vested interest in speaking out publicly on something like that. And also, I just realized that I jumped over the campaign finance piece.
Oh, yeah.
Can I circle back to that? Yeah. So the reason why we support the unlimited transfers between statewide candidates and the party is because that's already federal law, right? A candidate for U.S. in the example given by Paul Burns from VPIRG yesterday, a retiring U.S. senator wanted to give $1 million to a state party. I would weep openly, publicly, if they wanted to do that, because I could really use $1 million. But also there is nothing in federal law preventing that from happening. Whereas a statewide candidate for Secretary of State, Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor wants to give us money, they are capped at the $10,000 contribution limit. And where we ran into some problems with that last year is with our voter contact service. The fee for that is $10,000. For statewide candidates. And there is some dispute amongst the legal minds that advise us through this process as to whether or not that is a good in service with marketable value that does not get counted towards contribution limits or whether it is a contribution. So we are supportive of expanding that donation limit so that we don't run into those kind of logistical issues. One tiny suggestion on the language is maybe we want to change it from candidate to candidate committee so that there is an added layer, right? So, a multimillionaire self-funded candidate running for attorney general has to at least put the money into their own committee before it gets to the party. That adds a layer of disclosure to the process to make sure that it is public and open.
Yeah, we'll talk to Ledge Council about whether there is a real distinction given the definition of candidate in that section of the law, but I think that's a good flag that what we really are talking about when we talk about a candidate there is their committee. There isn't really even a distinction, I don't think, between the individual and their committee at that.
Yeah.
Once you're getting into the campaign.
Yeah, and I will obviously defer to council on that. They're the minds that understand this stuff better than I do. But what we're really trying to get at here is to make sure that we can provide all of the services that we want to provide to candidates running under the Democratic banner, while making sure that we're fairly compensated for that work.
So just to be clear, with the way it is today, if you have a candidate who is running for any of those statewide offices, lieutenant governor, treasurer, attorney general, just they're buying access to the statewide voter system, data system that your party runs, our party runs, would potentially put them over the top.
There is some disagreement amongst the people that are advising us as to whether or not that would put them over the top, and aligning state campaign finance law with federal campaign finance law would eliminate that confusion.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Dandino?
I'm available. You guys all know how to find me. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today, Jim.
Happy to be here. You too.
Don't know if we have our folks who had asked for some time to talk about the emergent media program. Sorry, I don't know everybody by. Well, we're running a few minutes early, so if you are ready to go, Robin and Sarah.
Yes.
We can pull up an extra chair for you. Thank you, Representative Murray.
And is there a way to plug in a slide deck or?
So what we typically do is have folks share that with our committee assistant, and we look at stuff on our devices so that folks can see this on Zoom. Do you have the ability to email that to us? That'd be great.
I shared it with them.
Before we jump to the next subject, I held in case I drop dead this afternoon for eating something.
That's dramatic.
Let's not do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
I'm seeing our guys.
Go ahead, Representative Hoover.
The only one that has. I am just fundamentally opposed to doing anything that would alter the ballot. It sounds like putting a designation on the ballot of somebody that's endorsed by the party is equivalent to putting a Eat at Joe's sign on there. And the ballot should be, I think, preserved pretty much as nonpartisan as possible.
Yeah, the only thing, so I know Representative Byron brought up the suggestion that Mr. Dane brought up yesterday.
Yeah.
That is not on the table. But I thought that it was interesting to hear that Mr. Dandino had a different opinion on that particular issue. I think that's what you're addressing.
It is.
Specifically. Yes.
You know, often amazing to me how sometimes in the heat of discussion, things that aren't on the table end up on the table.
Yeah, I would say I would not be in favor of that kind of a system like Connecticut has either. We are going to hear later this morning from the Franklin County Dems chair because there's a specific example from the last primary that I think would be important for the committee to know, and it's primarily why I'm so interested in this cross-party nomination question. It gets at what we have today, having a totally open filing and a totally open primary system leads to some shenanigans that I think confuse voters. That's my main thing. It's about being clear to voters about who this candidate is and which party they're affiliated with, and why I think it really is possible for folks to get multiple endorsements from parties. And there's nothing in the bill as it's presented that would preclude that. We're in a situation where a very small number of votes can lead to us printing a party's endorsement of a candidate on the ballot today that I think is misleading to voters. And we're going to hear about one example. So I think you're getting at the values of wanting to like kind of keep the partisanship off the ballot. I think if we proceeded with the cross-party nomination language that's in the draft language, we are narrowing that to just saying, you pick one lane, you stay in your lane, and that's that.
But I also want to say that I think as we move in that direction, we also have to recognize that we might very well be moving closer to ranked choice voting as opposed to three-way races all over the place that give us candidates that basically have 35-40% of the vote being seated, which effectively is 60% of the people saying, I don't want you. Just as a.
Yeah, and so that's where the interplay between the two sessions of the bill comes in. Yeah, we should talk more about whether it would have that effect or not. Representative Hingo.
Yeah, I don't want to take away from time from Champlain College, but this brings up it's now really muddy for me. I have no idea what we're trying to do with the bill because you're proposing to not have any parties written after anybody's name on the ballot.
No.
I think Representative Hooper was just rejecting the suggestion that Mr. Dane made yesterday about having a post-primary sort of, this is a real endorsement versus just a you won by the voters.
On the ballot, you can seal the approval all you want.
Yeah,
just not on the ballot.
right, exactly. Yeah, okay. And you're proposing that there be a certain number of signatures required to have dual party?
No, what's in the language that we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks is that you get one. You just get one. You can only have one. That's what's in that language that we've looked at. And so that's going to be the crux of a lot of the testimony we're going to hear later this morning. Is about that specific, you've got to pick which party's endorsement you want.
Okay, because I thought I heard you say something just now, something about the number, that there are very few number would get you to a party.
That's how it is
endorsement.
today.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how it is today.
that's-
So
that's
it's the
what I was
today versus what I have in the
confused
bill.
about.
What I have in the bill
Yeah.
eliminates the confusion.
Yes, but also eliminates other opportunities for people.
Which we'll get into.
Yep. Sorry to take.
No. We're switching gears. We're gonna push pause on our.
Yes, this is much less controversial. Hopefully. I don't.
Fun and
Famous last word.
Words, right?
we shouldn't set the bar too high.
So would you, Rob and Sarah, please introduce yourselves and tell us why you're here today, and thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. My name is Robin Perla, and this is my colleague, Sarah Jerger. We're both here from Champlain College to talk to you about Champlain College's impact on the creative sector and in support of the Vermont Creative Network, who's here today for the Creative Advocacy Day. So I did send a PDF slide deck. It's mostly just pretty pictures. So, I won't kind of give you the sign as to the ding as to when to move slides, but they just are images to support what we're going to talk to you about, which is Champlain College and our role is, currently and in the future as a driver of innovation and creativity in Vermont. For those of you who don't know, Champlain is a small professionally focused private college in Burlington. We have approximately 1,800 students in our traditional residential undergraduate programs. We also have a robust online program, which we're not going to talk about today, that draws from all over the country. And today what we want to talk to you about is our academic programs and our experiential learning opportunities that feed the Vermont creative economy. I guess I'll just introduce you.
Okay,
So
go right ahead.
Sarah's going to talk about the Emergent Media Center. She's the director of the Emergent Media Center, has been at Champlain College for 15 years, is also an artist in her own right. If any of you are from Chittenden County, she operates a free art gallery in Essex Junction in her front yard that has seen over 800 pieces of tiny art exchanged in its first year. So it's a community effort. And then I'm the assistant dean of the Creative Studio, which oversees our art, design, and communication programs. I'm also an associate professor in the graphic design program. I also am the former vice chair of the Vermont Arts Council's Board of Trustees and have had a 20-year career intersecting art, technology, and education. So anyways, we're going to talk, first I'll talk to you a little bit about our academic programs. We have two studios, which are sort of these academic units that encompass our arts, media, and technology. The first one is the Creative Studio. So the goal of the Creative Studio is to prepare our students for interdisciplinary creative careers and to support collaboration both in classes and in their extracurricular activities between students, faculty, and creative industries. The ease with which students can take courses in other creative majors is a differentiating factor for Champlain, as is the number of minors we have that share courses across majors. If those of you who have college-age students, you know that some of the larger schools, it becomes very difficult if you want to do something that's kind of not in the college that you've enrolled in. With art colleges, they tend to be quite siloed by discipline. And Champlain is, because we're small and because we're not an art college, we really have the flexibility to allow our students to become sort of Swiss Army knives of creative endeavors and professional careers, which serves them really well, especially as they start looking for jobs. Our current majors include, it's a laundry list, but animation, broadcast, communication, creative media, filmmaking, graphic design, et cetera, et cetera. You can look at the list on your deck. But many of our students go on to have careers in the creative sector in Vermont. Many of our students were born and raised in Vermont and want to stay here, but also many of them come to Vermont for the skiing and stay for the community, right? So there's, on the slide deck, you'll see a very, just a surface look at some of the the jobs in the creative sector that our creative studio students are involved in, including the City of Burlington, OnLogic, 7th Generation Stowe, North Country Bank, Burton, Dealer.com, Scout Digital, 1% for the Sugarbush, Tata Harper, and many, many more. That was a 5-minute search on my LinkedIn. That's how I came up with that list. And then we also have a really unique program that is really what sort of made Champlain's name in the country as an institution, which is our game studio. For those of you who don't know, you'd be surprised, actually, the demographic of games is not what you'd think. Actually, women are the largest, middle-aged women are the largest sector in the gaming industry. That being said, I'm guessing most of you are not playing console AAA games like, I don't know, I can't even think of one because I don't really play them myself. But anyways.
Fortnite.
But it is a multi-billion-dollar industry encompassing traditional entertainment sectors such as Blizzard and Ubisoft, but also includes other things that you may not think of, serious games, like Alkili, the first company with an FDA-approved prescription game treatment for juvenile ADHD. Simulations for the military or aviation and aeronautics complex. It's also used, VR, I'm sure maybe some of you have heard, has been used extensively in the treatment of PTSD and other serious psychological issues, mental health issues. Gamification is also used in marketing and PR, which we all know, unfortunately. We've all been subject to, marketing's attempt at gamifying things. So the Game Studio, again, is a multidisciplinary program. We draw from multiple divisions, and they work together throughout their 4 years at the college to make games. The Game Studio graduates, however, unlike the Creative Studio graduates, the Game Studio graduates often leave Burlington to find employment, which when you look at the list of employers on the slide deck, you'll see it's much shorter than the Creative Studio list. That being said, we've had notable success with companies such as Game Theory, Red Magpie, and Sunday Month, all launched in Burlington by Champlain graduates. Game Theory Co. is a women-led organization. It began as an indie entertainment game company, but as it transitioned into the serious and educational game space, partnering with organizations to create games for education and research. Red Magpie, also women and non-binary led, is a 501c3 nonprofit doing its part. This is their mission, to dismantle the patriarchy and white supremacy through uplifting underrepresented video game developers, which they accomplish through education and game production. Sunday Month is also an indie game developer, which emerged from their senior capstone project. One thing I want to note as we think about games in Vermont and retaining these graduates in the state is that it's also been interesting for me to note that, as with many other tech industries, remote work for games has exploded since the pandemic. And a quick look through my LinkedIn, how I do all my research, confirmed for me that many of our recent Game Studio graduates are living in Burlington while working remotely across the country for AAA game companies. Montreal is less than 2 hours from Burlington, has a thriving game industry. And with our Champlain College graduates interested in staying put to work remotely, there's so much opportunity to engage and harness that creative spirit and expand on the slowly emerging indie game industry here in Vermont. So, as I talked about, as I was talking about these different programs, a huge part of this professionally focused education at Champlain College is this interdisciplinary approach and this experiential approach where students are working together on project-based learning, having real world experiences in the community. And one of the linchpins of how we do that at Champlain is our centers of experience. One you may have heard of is the Leahy Center for Digital Forensics and Cybersecurity. That's one of our kind of most successful centers of experience, but our other most successful center for experience is the Emergent Media Center, which is what Sarah's going to talk to us about.
Yeah, thank you. So the Emergent Media Center, we were founded back in 2006. And since then, we have employed over 1,000 students and completed over 100 projects partnering with over 60 clients. Some of those are very familiar Vermont organizations, such as UVM College of Medicine, ECHO down at the lakefront, Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, the airport, Vermont Teddy Bear, King Street Center, OVR Technology, if you've heard of them, they're based at Hula. And so the EMC is a creative studio primarily focused on applied research and experimentation. So we're using novel applications of emerging technologies, immersive media, and human-centered design processes to design creative solutions brought to us by community partners. So these applied research areas may include things like serious games, which Robin had mentioned, and simulation, embodied systems, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, all the realities, mobile apps, assistive and adaptive technologies, physical computing, just to name a few. There's just so much that we can do. Research and development areas are really determined by the grant opportunities or other sponsorship opportunities, as well as originating from different faculty interest areas and their expertise. So in addition to doing that technological exploration, we are always looking at how we can address the wicked problems, if you're familiar with that phrase, in a design for good model. How can we use media, technology, and design to do good things in the world and cause positive impact? So we might be looking at research areas determined by the technology itself, or we might be looking at the societal problem needing creative solutions. So the work that we do falls into three categories. We have studio projects at the EMC. We have our Champlain Maker program, which is in partnership with Generator. And we do design thinking consultation services for companies. So we are student driven. We offer paid professional experiences for our students from all majors across the college. They conceptualize, prototype, and produce that wide range of media, which I talked about, to solve those problems. And when we say emergent, we're talking about new and up and coming technologies, but also using existing technologies in really new and interesting ways. So the teams consist of students with both technical and creative skills. They're working really collaboratively together to explore and produce this really cool cutting edge work, like the work of the future, the work that we need. And they're applying, enhancing, and expanding on what they're learning in the classroom and practicing it with a real world project in a very cross-disciplinary way, like they will in the professional workplace. So it's a paid job outside of their academics, and it's a stepping stone for them out into the professional workplace. For our partners, who we call our clients, they are getting the creative and beginner's minds of these students and their technical know-how to solve some of these really big challenges. And we offer our reassurance to both our partners and our students that all of the work is supported by our team of professional staff and faculty. We don't just throw the students out there to go willy-nilly and do what they want. They have this guidance and support. So a couple of examples, which I'll just highlight for you, of a long list of examples. You won't be able to see the moving GIFs on these screens, but a couple of recent projects that we worked on were with Beta Technologies and with Vermont Symphony Orchestra. I'm sure we're all likely familiar with Beta, the renowned electro-aerospace manufacturer here. So their cutting-edge technology is really incredible, and it can also be very hard for people to understand if they're not familiar with the science and engineering behind it. So to help ease this challenge, we partnered with Beta, and our students created an animated game prototype to really help visitors to Beta learn how their aircraft works in a very accessible way. We also just recently completed year one of a 3-year partnership with the Vermont Symphony Orchestra. In an effort to appeal to younger audiences, VSO came to us and wanted our students to create a visual media experience that would enhance and accompany the orchestra performances. And so this year, our students created short experimental films, which were projected behind the Vermont Symphony and Vermont Youth Orchestras at the Flynn. And next year, we're going to be working on motion graphics and projection mapping that will break outside of the rectangular box of the screen and look at putting projections onto architectural elements inside the Flynn.
Awesome stuff happening at Champlain. We're also we've just established our 2030 strategic plan. We have a new president. We're working closely with Burlington on the plans for the innovation hub in the South End with the Champlain connector kind of dumping right onto Lakeside Avenue, which is where we have our small Lakeside campus, which is where the Emergent Media Center is. So we're looking at what's next and how to grow these relationships, both to expand our creative degree offerings, and then also to continue to expand our partnerships with the creative community in Burlington and throughout Vermont. So thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. Yeah, I know we're sort of at time, but if anybody has any quick questions.
Happy
And yeah, please.
I think these are relatively quick. Two things, please. So my daughter and son-in-law are graduates of Linden State College. I know that they would take my head if they heard me call it Northern Vermont University at Linden.
It is.
Correct. But they both, he was in the weather arena and she was in the animation area. Do you all partner with them in any way? Because I like seeing the smaller schools having that impact, you know what I mean? I'm just curious if you collaborate at all on some level.
We have in the past, like we've done, in the creative studio, we'll have portfolio days that are open to all college students from Vermont, and we would get a lot from NVU as well as from Champlain and UVM. We also look at, through grants, a lot of the NSF grants, the larger grants require collaboration, especially when you're looking at sort of grants that are geared towards rural communities. So the EPSCoR grants, those require collaboration between different institutions. I don't know that, and the college is in a EPSCoR process being run by UVM, the application process. And so we've got several small colleges, but I don't know that one of them is NVU. But I love that. I think it's great. It's a great curiosity, and it's something certainly.
Again, on some level, you're competitors. There's no question. Not hardcore, but you know what I mean? And I was just kind of curious because like I said, I'm a big fan of the small colleges and what they do for students in the state of Vermont.
Yes, and I think we'd all love to see NVU stay here and be successful, right? And us too. I mean, it's a hard, as you may or may not know, there's been a population cliff in the Northeast, and so we've seen a lot of colleges closing over the past 5 years, and there will be more. And so we have to really think creatively as to how we can stay relevant and vital.
And my second thing real quick was, I don't think you touched on it, but and it may not be your piece of the pie, but the forensic lab that they have, that you all have at Champlain. I'm retired from the Guard. I know we use them for reasons I can't get into, but you're probably aware of some of those things. Did you all touch on that at all with any of your works or?
We share we have some administrative support, and so we kind of work as colleagues and collaborators in that way. But our missions are quite different.
This creative side.
Yes. And then again, this, we were invited to come here as part of the Vermont Creative Network to really think about the impact of Champlain on the creative sector. And then arguably, I guess cybersecurity is actually pretty creative in terms of how you're, it's the problem solving, but maybe not as visually appealing.
It's an area I don't think a lot of people realize that you all have. It's actually a very robust program considering the size of the school that exists on a national level, I think.
Yes, and that's a major part of our strategic plan moving forward, for sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you for being here today. I think you particularly landed here and some of the advocates you're working with because of our jurisdictional interest in information technology. And it's good to know about these resources that are kind of on the way out on the bleeding edge of some of the creative work.
Yes, for sure. And especially to that end, I didn't have quite enough time to go into detail about some of our plans in kind of this innovation hub that's sort of bubbling up in the south end of Vermont. But keep an eye on that as we think about sort of these new technologies, in terms of immersive media. Our hope is to be able to put a major investment in that area in the next few years. So
I had whispered to Representative Byron only half jokingly when you were talking about the beta software that you had developed about doing a field trip. So we
Yes.
Yes.
in touch.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good field trip.
Thank you very much.
And I will leave, this is information for you guys about the Vermont Creative Network and the work they're doing. I can leave this here for you, and also they're in the card room all day. If you have other questions for them, they'd love to have you come.
Representative Hango before Robert.
That's okay. This question is for you.
Oh, it's for me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies.
So how does this fit into our portfolio?
So we have been asked since IT generally, and there are people who are visiting the State House on different days where it doesn't fit into the specific bills and policy work that we're doing right now. But I got a request to give a little bit of time to folks who are visiting the State House and our committee to tell us about what they're doing. And so I was.
Okay, so similar to like somebody else is coming in, Rights and Democracy is coming in to
Now,
do the
yes.
same thing. Okay,
Exactly.
all
So
right,
this is a
got
little
it.
bit of a pause
Okay.
for this hour-ish from our work specifically on the bills that we have to welcome people who are visiting the State House today to tell us about their priorities. So
Got it.
sorry, I didn't.
Thank you.
I didn't frame that up well.
No,
We are
not
kind
at
of
all.
going on a couple of tangents here because folks happen to be in the State House today.
Great, thank you.
So with that, I would like to invite up folks from RAD. I believe Tom Proctor, you're leading the delegation today, and yeah, so we'll take about 15 minutes with you all, take a break, and then get back on testimony about our elections bill.
Well, thank you, Chair McCarthy and members of House Gov.Ops Committee. Welcome to welcome you all today. My name is Tom Proctor. I'm the Housing Justice Organiser for Rights and Democracy in Vermont. Before I begin, I wish to share land acknowledgement with the committee. Rights and Democracy acknowledges the Mohican in southern Vermont and Abenaki people as traditional land caretakers in Endanika, which includes parts of Vermont, New Hampshire, New England, and Quebec as guests on unceded territory of the Mohican and Abenaki people. We honour their ancestors, elders, and relations past, present, and emerging. We also acknowledge that our nation has benefited from the uncompensated and exploited labour represented in the legacy of slavery and the present-day reality of migrant farm workers. Thank you. Rights and Democracy, which we call RAD for short, and our sibling organisation, the Rights and Democracy Institute, were founded in 2015 on the theory of change that takes people power year after year to make the kind of big, bold, long-term changes we want to see in this country. Our members are from all walks of life, intergenerational, multicultural, activists, organisers, but most importantly, passionate fighters for true social justice and meaningful change in our communities and across the state. Our current systems are rooted in historic oppressions, deeply dysfunctional and fragile. When those fragile systems break, Vermonters who have been systemically kept out of places of power are those most impacted. Abenaki and Indigenous persons, racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQIA individuals, individuals with disabilities, senior citizens, new Americans, youth, poor, are the people who carry the weight of the policies and the systems gone wrong. These individuals are nearly 80% of the Vermont voting population and are the least represented in our state government, and are in some cases wholly invisible to those who enact the policies. Our mission is to bring people together to take action, to build healthy communities, and make the values of our communities guide the policies of our government. We believe we can achieve a society where people earn a living wage and have access to affordable healthcare, where a progressive and equitable tax system supports an economy that protects the environment and human rights. It is our pleasure to testify to you today and share the visions of a more just and vibrant Vermont. I'll kick off by sharing with you with our 2023 platform. Vermont must do its part to ensure a just transition to a clean energy future that mandates renewable energy and ends a reliance on dirty, polluting fossil fuels. And we must guarantee that everybody's benefits, especially Vermonters, have been most impacted by past and current harms. That's why this year we're supporting the passage of S5, the Affordable Heat Act, while still calling for greater equity provisions within the bill. We are also supporting efforts to reform renewable energy standard and ensure that Vermont can get to 30% in state renewable energy and 30% regional renewable energy in the next decade. In state renewable energy is the key to our state resiliency and helps build the green economy that Vermont communities need, and doesn't shift the climate burden of our energy use to other states. We are also supporting H56, the Ratepayer Protection and Thermal Energy Network Act. This bill in House Environment and Energy would extend electric ratepayer protections to more Vermonters adds a proven solution to Vermont's energy choices by creating a pathway for geothermal and moves Vermont away from combusting fuels by prohibiting gas expansion and new service territories. Okay, my part. Vermont is in a housing crisis, so we all know this. This means there isn't enough affordable housing for Vermonters, and many Vermonters are forced to live in expensive, unsafe places. Tenants who bring concerns about their living conditions to the landlord also have to worry about eviction and homelessness. We need housing for all. That's why we need to work both on creating new affordable housing, like provisions in the Senate Housing Omnibus Bill, and we also need to protect tenants' rights, and in fact, create new tenants' rights. The Housing Omnibus Bill includes many needed zoning, Act 250 and housing discrimination changes that we support and hope that the bill will pass the House and Senate. To meet the needs of tenants in Vermont, we must also pass statewide just cause eviction. Municipal just cause eviction charter changes that have been democratically approved by local voters and will come to this committee when they pass in those local areas. Election diversion programs and cap the amount of rent increases that tenants have to bear. Last year, the legislature passed Burlington's city charter change for just cause eviction, but the governor vetoed the bill. We need to build off that 99 votes that the House got in the veto override and pass that bill this year. We also need to act swiftly on any further JCE charter changes that make their way to this committee this year. Thousands of Vermont tenants are counting on you to grant them the tenant protections they have specifically voted for. We also need to ensure that Vermont has all the data it needs to accurately track our rental market, including where the units are, who owns them, the accountability of the unit, and other pertinent information. Without this basic information, we'll always be behind on understanding the true rental crisis and it limits our ability to take action for Vermont renters. To achieve a food system in Vermont, we must create equitable access to land, farming, and food. We are glad to see the passage of universal school meals in 2022, but it's time to find a permanent funding solution to ensure that all Vermont's children get the healthy meals they need without the stigma. The Land Access Opportunity Board is an equity board created by the legislature in the last biennium and is housed in the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. In the coming weeks, this board will release a report on recommendations that the legislature should consider and take action on. But what we need to know now is that the board will need continued funding to do its work. That means fiscal year 2024 budget adjustment of $1 million. This will also allow the board to formalise its procedures and set itself up for the long-term work that is needed in creating greater access and opportunity for those Vermonters that have been historically left out. Workers in Vermont retail, restaurant, agriculture and other service industries play deeply vital roles in our community. Yet these workers are often underpaid and underprotected in their workplaces. To thrive, all workers need a fair and dignified wages, full benefits and strong legal protections. The sub-minimum wage, a direct legacy of slavery, particularly impacts women and the disproportionately women of colour. It is time to end the sub-minimum wage and pass one fair wage for all Vermonters. We also need to pass the VT Pro Act that strengthens workers' rights. When it comes to public education, we have a long way to go to make all Vermont schools equitable and welcoming to all students. We need to remove police from schools, make anti-discrimination policies more accessible, and develop education funding system that is equitable as possible by implementing the recommendations of the Income-Based Education Tax Study Committee. Vermont is also known as a leader for voting rights and democracy, and we need to continue that leadership by implementing a system of ranked choice voting for the presidential primaries and then for all elections. Ranked choice voting gives more access to more candidates and gives voters real choice at the ballot box. We must also create a state legislature that everyone can take part in. This means greatly increasing the salary and benefits for our state legislators and also the per diems for those appointed to state boards and committees. The last crisis I will speak to certainly isn't the least, the overdose crisis. Vermont has become a leader in the deadliness of the overdose crisis. The legislature last year passed many important provisions that were undone by governor's veto. This year, we must pass permanent buprenorphine decriminalization for personal use, create overdose prevention sites, make accessible community-based syringe services to all Vermonters, create a mobile methadone clinic pilot program, and expand treatment education for first responders. This means supporting H72 and H222. It is important that we lift the voices of people. Today, I'm joined by some of our amazing leaders. Today, 24 individuals are speaking their truths in a committee throughout the legislature. So joining me are Rights and Democracy supporters and allies, Ann Zimmerman to speak on her efforts organising around the Brattleboro Just Cause Eviction, Madeline Heller to speak on her experience engaging with tenants across Vermont, and Bridget Mientka to speak on her eviction experience and the efforts she's contributed towards the Winooski Just Cause Eviction campaign. The first speaker today is Ann.
I just want to frame things up. Welcome. Please take the witness chair. We have very limited time this morning because we're working on a number of bills. So I just wanted to make sure, since we've budgeted 15 minutes for this, that if everybody can kind of take a couple minutes and introduce these ideas to us, we really do want to hear from folks. I also have to give the committee a break, and we have the Lieutenant Governor coming in at 10:15. So once we get into some of these issues, happy to have folks back if we're taking up bills on these matters. So sorry that we're crunched for time this morning.
Sorry. If I can edit a little bit. So I'm Ann Zimmerman, as Tom said. I live down in Guilford, which is in the Brattleboro area. And for context, I am a renter. I am someone who raised 2 kids in Southern Vermont rental housing market as a low-income single parent. And housing was, during the time I was raising my kids, the single biggest stressor in my life. And to a pretty good extent continues to be, even though my kids are grown and no longer dependents. And I'm pretty sure you're well aware that we are in a housing crisis, particularly in the rental market. So I'm not trying to drive that particular point home. I'm here to speak about why we need to end no cause eviction and make just cause eviction into the law. And at the very least, this body needs to approve local charter changes where they are passed by the voters, as will happen in Brattleboro. I want to put a human face on the crisis of no-cause eviction by speaking to the situation down in the Brattleboro market. My friend Damaris and a group of her fellow tenants who reside or recently resided at a housing complex in West Brattleboro known as Westbrook Court, you may have read about. There's been some recent coverage, but I don't believe it's unique by any means. Damaris and a few of her neighbors, whom I've gotten to know recently, had created a community of neighbors who gardened and barbecued together and who generally looked out for each other, especially since a number of them had disabilities and were aging or had other life challenges. They had created a pretty nice situation and felt as though they were good tenants who paid their rent and didn't cause any trouble. And last October, Damaris and at least a dozen, possibly as many as 20 residents of Westbrook Court received notices that their leases would not be renewed. No cause was given, and they had either 60 or 90 days to move out, and were supposed to move out in the middle of winter, no less. The majority of those who got the notice of lease non-renewal were handicapped in some way, are elderly or low income, and a common thread seems to be that most, if not all, were on some kind of housing assistance. The complex had been sold recently to a private equity corporation, and it seems the new owners didn't want to deal with any of that. Others in the complex who were offered a new lease saw their rent go up exorbitantly and also had to cough up more money for a new deposit, higher deposit. And of course, that caused immediate distress because of the extreme difficulty of finding housing right now in the Brattleboro area, let alone anything affordable. Just for example, Damaris's neighbor, Matt, who needs to be in handicap accessible unit, is facing major surgery that will put him in a wheelchair. It's been put off a bunch of times because of COVID, and he can barely walk at the moment, so let alone pick up and move. Another former neighbor is a single mother with a daughter in high school, and she was unable to find housing nearby, so she was forced to take something in Keene, New Hampshire, while her daughter stayed behind and is couch surfing so she can finish the school year. So I don't actually have a hard time imagining that situation being replicated around town. I think that it probably happens in a number of families. So this is breaking up a community as well as separating a family. Damaris herself is in her 70s and has Parkinson's. She also needs a first floor unit, and she was forced to stop working during the pandemic because of her added vulnerability. And what I know that she would like you to know, she said very specifically to me, she wants you to know how much trauma comes from finding out you have 60 or 90 days to move while trying to survive on a low income in this housing market. There is pretty much nowhere to go. So I realize that you don't govern by anecdote. There's so many stories from down where I live that it's important to me that these people are real to you. A pretty good friend of mine has been couch surfing for months when she was told she needed to vacate her apartment because it was for sale. So she vacated her apartment, and rather than the building being sold, another tenant moved in paying higher rent. And, at least she doesn't have kids. But I remember when selling a building, it was a selling point if the building was fully rented to tenants. And that is no longer true. People are told that they have to move just so that the rent can be jacked up by the new owners, or maybe even by the same owner because, oh, by the way, they didn't sell it after all. And I'll just add that I realize that all of these folks are victims of a housing crisis that is driven by a lot of forces, some of which need more sweeping solutions, and no one who is advocating for just cause eviction thinks that this basic tenant protection is any kind of panacea for all of our housing problems. But this is something that can be done to alleviate some of the considerable stress of folks who are otherwise in a precarious housing situation, which renting is almost by definition, and give more stability to families and communities. And I have certainly felt that acute stress myself, worrying about not being able to find a place to live. And if you have never experienced that particular terror as a parent, I assure you there is nothing quite like it. So to me, here is the crux of the matter. One of the vacated apartments in Westbrook that had been rented for $1,050, I recently saw advertised for $1,700. It's very modest. There's nothing special. And that is out of range of someone receiving housing assistance. So you can see why the new corporate owners would want to remove the people in order to jack up the rent. Most people I know could not afford that rent. It is out of step with the reality of local wages, although perhaps it may seem more normal for people who are moving into the area from other markets. And these are also apartments that are in need of repair. They don't seem to be happening, those repairs. It would appear that the goal is to make a lot of money very quickly, not to invest in long-term quality housing. Just cause eviction would protect renters in places like that who pay their rent and haven't done anything wrong from having to be in a constant state of worry over losing their housing. And we will all be better for that when, there's less constant turnover. And I will just finish by saying that I have listened to argument after argument from some of the smaller landlords who aren't part of that new corporate model, who complain that this is the only way they can remove the quote unquote problem tenants. They insist that they only want to get rid of the bad ones and should not have to renew a lease to destructive or dirty tenants, or maybe even the other tenants are complaining about them. And obviously I don't have time to speak to everything that's wrong with that assumption, but I would submit that there is a system of checks and balances in place whereby those committing violations of health and safety, excessive noise, illegal activity, non-payment of rent, or other lease violations can be removed. And when there is an inherent imbalance in the power relationship, as there is between landlord and tenant, the haves and have-nots, if you will, it involves something as basic as keeping a roof over one's head. We absolutely need to keep to that system of checks and balances rather than maintain the shortcut that is no cause eviction. So I'm asking you that if you believe that housing is a human right, and I hope that we agree that housing is a human right, that you will legislate in support of just cause eviction. And thank you so much for your time and letting me go on.
Thank you.
Hi, Mike.
Would you like Madeline to go?
Madeline, that'd be great, yeah.
Madeline, I think you're with us via Zoom. We're running a little over, so I just want to try to keep the comments brief. And like I said, as we dig into specific issues as they come before us, I'm happy to have folks back.
Good morning, Chair McCarthy. I will try to keep this brief, and thank you all for having us today and listening to these stories. As mentioned, I'm Madeline Hiller. I'm a resident of Woodstock, and I'm currently a senior environmental policy major at Middlebury College. This past semester, I had the opportunity to work with RAD to combat the split incentive issue by creating a policy proposal that would incentivize Vermont landlords to weatherize their units with no further financial burden on tenants. However, while doing this research, my peers and I realized that there are two key steps that must be taken before implementing a weatherization policy. And so first, we really need to pass a statewide rental registry and a just cause eviction standard, as Ann mentioned. Establishing the rental registry is important because it creates built-in accountability for property managers and landlords, plus gives lawmakers such as yourselves better insight into the reality of the housing crisis in Vermont. And the just cause eviction standard protects tenants from unfair and retaliatory evictions, as it requires landlords and property managers to have a legally allowable reason to evict tenants. Additionally, just cause eviction measures also protect good landlords from bad tenants. So with just cause eviction, landlords can still evict for non-payment, breach of lease, or breaking of tenant obligations. And I just wanted to reiterate that you all be receiving any just cause eviction charter changes that pass in March. as Tom mentioned, and we'll also be working with the Burlington Just Cause Eviction Charter change in the near future. So without tenant protections, almost 30% of Vermonters live in fear that at any moment their landlord can arbitrarily evict them. And just cause eviction standards will allow tenants not to be fearful to report code violations or landlord harassment because they know that they will be able to stay in their home and not be evicted at the end of their lease. I recently had the privilege to speak with a tenant in the Burlington area who had to couch surf for 1 year. And after being forced to move from their home and live day to day, not knowing where they may sleep the next day, this tenant felt very stressed and disorganized. She felt that she could not be fully present at her job, could not focus on her relationships, and did not have time to take care of herself. When she ultimately found an apartment, she was afraid of pushing too hard for the property manager to do the right thing, because she did not want to be evicted for simply asking for an infrastructure or utility fix. She also felt uncomfortable addressing these issues out of fear of experiencing the anxieties that couch surfing had added to her life the previous year. So for other tenants experiencing the same reality, unjust evictions could lead them to losing their jobs, leaving their community, splitting up their family, moving to a different state, or even becoming homeless. And the desperation of needing a roof over your head should not override having a quality living situation. Having a quality living situation should be and is a fundamental human right. And with just cause eviction standards, tenants will not have to fear the power dynamic between themselves and their landlord. Instead, they will be empowered to advocate for themselves and address whatever issues there may be with their living situation. Finally, I'd like to finish up with a story, a recent eviction that happened in Brattleboro. Just 2 weeks ago, a resident of Brattleboro and her family were evicted from their home. And this was during that cold snap that we had with negative 30-degree wind chills. So the landlord had shown up unannounced in 2022 to the home and decided that the house was too messy and that the tenants were not abiding by the contract. So in Vermont, a landlord must give 48 hours notice before going to inspect a property. And this landlord decided to evict the family after she broke the law by arriving to inspect this house without prior notice. So when they got the eviction notice, the tenant immediately began searching for housing and had been looking since August of 2022. However, due to the lack of affordable housing for families in the Brattleboro area, they could not find anything that would accommodate them. So the tenant, her husband, and their children, who are 7 and 3 years old, are now living in a motel until they can secure another place to live. Throughout the eviction process, her only hope has been to have a roof over her head, somewhere she can properly raise her children and build a true home. So I'm asking you all to really take these stories into consideration. And it is clear that this is not the only family that is going through this. A tenant in Burlington is definitely not the only tenant who has had to couch surf in that area or be stressed about when they can find new long-term housing. So I urge you all to seriously consider this new legislation and help these people who should have a roof over their head and deserve to have a roof over their head. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us, Madeline. So is Bridget the
Last one, yeah.
last one? Okay, great. Bridget, sorry that I just want to reiterate that we are way over the time today. So happy to have you back. But if you want to give us some brief comments, that'd be really great. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you. Good morning. This will take about 2 minutes, and that should bring us right to our 15 minutes that we were allotted. I'm here today to talk about my support for just cause eviction. As a Vermonter who works in affordable housing, who has been campaigning in Winooski, knocking on doors, talking to renters and homeowners, there's a lot of support out there for just cause eviction. People want to see it become policy. I am someone who's been personally impacted by a no-cause eviction. Last year, my husband and I received a notice that we were being no-cause evicted from our rental. The notice stated we had 30 days to vacate and offered no explanation whatsoever. Let me be clear, we were rule-following, rent-paying tenants. We were not problem tenants. And the motivation was an egregious rent increase. It's painful for me to even talk about the months that followed the eviction, and going through a no-cause eviction is destabilizing and traumatic. We went from being a happy, active family to being completely stressed out and anxious overnight. It impacted our mental health, our work, and literally every aspect of our lives. My husband and I weren't even sure if we were going to be able to stay in Vermont when we were going through our no-cause eviction. There's so little housing available, and I'm not just talking about affordable housing, I'm talking about any housing. Finding suitable housing for a family of 4 takes time, and it's not something people can reasonably do in 30 days. We were just completely unprepared for anything like that to happen. Just cause eviction policy would have been a safeguard for my family. It would have protected us from the undue stress and hardship of facing an unjust eviction. Nothing could have prepared me for the idea that one day, apropos of nothing, I would get a 30-day eviction notice. There's no reason for that. It's senseless, and yet it's a common practice in Vermont. We need to do better. My children are 8 and 10 years old, and it was impossible for my husband and I to hide our stress from them, so we didn't. We talked to them about what was going on, and we taught them that everyone deserves a decent place to live and that housing is a human right. So my children also have a message for you today. They would like you to please support just cause eviction so that nobody has to go through something as unfair as a no cause eviction now. We're homeowners now, thanks in large part to a VA loan, but the last thing I want to do is close the door on my way in. My family did not become homeless, but others will not be so fortunate. Vermonters need tenant protection laws, and Vermont renters deserve safe and stable housing. They do not deserve to lose their housing in arbitrary, retaliatory, and discriminatory evictions. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us, Bridget. So we don't have a bill before us yet on these specific housing issues. This committee did hear and pass a charter change related to this last biennium, and I anticipate we will probably have some policy around just cause eviction that we'll have to discuss this year. So I appreciate this kind of preview into what some of the issues are, because it is very serious, and I don't want the limited time that we have this morning to be an indication of the seriousness with which we take that testimony. I really want to appreciate the folks who came for the RAD Lobby Day today. We're thankful to have members and people from the community come and testify here at House Gov.Ops. So thank you all for being here, and sorry that we're so crunched for time with our bills now, but I imagine we'll be taking up these issues later in the session. With that, I think what we're going to do is I've shuffled a little bit of the testimony around, I think, so that we can hear from the Lieutenant Governor on our elections bill, and then we'll take a quick break before we dive into the last couple of people we're going to have testifying before lunch. So just wanted to give the committee that heads up. Solid through even though we're a little over time. Andrea's working her magic with me over here to get us back on track. So I want to welcome Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman here today to talk about the draft miscellaneous elections bill that we have before us. Thank you so much for being with us, Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Committee of Jurisdiction. I appreciate it. And hello to a few of you that I haven't quite had the chance to meet, but I think I've had the opportunity to say hello to many of you, and some of you I've known for a number of years. I want to first stress the importance of this conversation. I really appreciate that you're having it. The folks from across the political spectrum and across the issue spectrum greatly are impacted by how our election system works, the choices that they have, the systems by which they get information, and of course, who is then elected and sits at these esteemed tables, determining the outcome of issues that many, many people care about, from housing and economic issues, climate, racial or gender inequities, small business rules, development. The list obviously goes on and on. So this conversation is critical. Thank you. At the end, the foundation of it all is the elections. The rules that we play by and the financing systems greatly impact the choices people have and the impact they have for their voice, their views to be represented here. So I think I just present that as the scale of weight of what you're deciding, I think is quite tremendous. Before I get into details, I will say that overarching with many of these changes, and I think there are some provisions in the proposal that are good, many of these provisions actually consolidate party power and reduce transparency and reduce options for voters. And I think that's the wrong way to go. I'll go through in the order of the different sections because that's the easiest. And I will shorten this and get it submitted to you in writing before the end of the day. First would be the quote, sore loser provision. What is the problem that is attempting to being solved? And it may be that I've missed some instances where a spoiler situation was created when someone lost a primary or ran as an I or another party, but is the potential ramifications of this going to create more problems than it will solve? So in doing my research and my own memory over 26 odd years, but my memory is not perfect over all that time, I know of one situation where a candidate ran a Democratic primary in an attempt, as many do, to reduce the three-way conundrum in the general election, which then creates the spoiler problem from the sore loser problem. They felt that in the primary, the scales were tipped against them. I think you heard testimony earlier this morning that parties can already do that if they want, either subtly, quietly, which sometimes happens, or more blatantly. Party can say, we want these two and not that one, or this one and not that one. So that can already happen, but it happens rather rarely. In that particular instance, they weren't invited to some of the House parties that were meet the candidates in our primary. So they felt unfairly weighed against them on the tilt of balance. With that, they lost the primary. They ran in the general election and a Republican won. This would be an example up in Lamoille County, I believe 6, maybe 8 years ago. I did a little research back because on the testimony yesterday, Representative Murwicki mentioned this happened in his district, I think. We talked about it after the meeting, maybe 2008 was what it looked like it was. So with that in mind, going back to 2008, which is 16 years or 15, 16 years, 8 election cycles. In my digging around, I found 3 instances. There may be more, but that's what I found. And I tend to pay a fair amount of attention to elections. So 3 instances out of 8 election cycles, 180 seats, that's 1,440 seats with 3 instances. So this problem has occurred 0.2% of the time. If I've missed 3 and double it, that's 0.4% of the time. Hold that in your mind for a minute to think about what would happen if folks felt like the sore loser provision was removed. If the sore loser provision is removed and someone says, well, I could work to be cross-partisan to reduce the spoiler problem and run in one primary and try to get a write-in in another, and I'll tie that in later, then what happens? Are they going to choose to run in that primary where they feel they're already going to be pushed out in terms of odds of winning, either through the money primary or through the local district efforts? In which case, why wouldn't they just run in the general election feeling they'd actually have a better chance at reaching more voters? How many more spoiler problems would be created by that? Considering Vermont has a more robust third party and more robust independent, I think last term there were 5, I think there's been as many as 7 independents than almost any other state. Is that what you want to create? I'm not sure that's really what the voters would want. With that, made my point there. Independents filing before the primary. I think there's a reason why independents would get up to 3 days or 5 days, I can't remember exactly what it is, to file after a primary. In a primary election cycle, it may turn out that folks think someone is going to run, then they don't. And so suddenly there's only one party with a candidate on the general election ballot. Well, there's a lot of folks that might think differently that would say, well, wait a minute, let's all get behind this other individual as an independent so that we don't have this fringe right or fringe left person as the only option we have. But secondly, what if there are multiple contested primaries and the winners of those primaries are both fringe, or all three primaries are fringe in some way or another, or extreme, or use whatever choice word is apropos in today's political environment? What if a number of people in the community thought, well, wait a minute, there's nobody that really covers the bulk of the way a lot of people in our town think or our district think? And they could say, wait a minute, let's get someone to run, or let's get someone to run for sheriff when you learn of something that happens after the filing deadline is passed. This is an opportunity for communities to do that. So I think it's important to allow for independents to file after a primary. Although, again, I don't have the numbers. I didn't have time to do the research. Maybe you have. But I would hope before you change that, you look at how often does that really happen and what have the consequences been? Are they so terrible that they warrant a change, or is this allowance valuable? I, as someone who's long advocated for campaign finance reform, I think unlimited campaign contributions to a party is just a step in the wrong direction. I can tell you how hard it is. Vermont's one of the hardest states to raise money, both for candidates and for parties. On the other hand, I think we've had fairly successful elections. We've had people be able to get their message out. I don't think we need to have huge quantities of money to reach most people in the scale districts that you're all running in, and even statewide. I think having grassroots networks and developing those networks, parties are networks, organizations are networks, you can reach people with your message. I don't think removing campaign finance limitations is a good idea. If anything, I think there's areas to strengthen that.
Before you move on, Lieutenant Governor Zuckman, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Absolutely.
Did you hear the testimony this morning from Mr. Danino from the Vermont Democratic Party about how that current limitation makes it so that a candidate who wants to, for instance, buy into the Democratic Party's voter network, it may already, just by virtue of the limit that we have right now, not be able to do that if they're a statewide candidate, whereas federal candidates for Congress and Senate already have the ability to give money to their own party in that way.
As someone who has run in the primary, I've never heard that as a candidate, we were limited due to campaign finance from having access to NGP van, for instance. I believe the price for a statewide candidate was actually $12,500. I heard something about 10,000 earlier, but I was unsure what that was referenced to.
The current limit is $10,000. So a statewide candidate can only give $10,000.
Can only give $10,000. So do you want to go into how that ultimately and how that works? Do you want to expose that at the moment, or would you rather not?
So we talked about it in committee already. It's that it basically forces people to have PACs that then do an end run around that campaign finance limit. So the desire here, I just want to be really clear that the characterization that we're, somehow going backwards in terms of transparency and accountability, that we're actually trying in this committee with that language to consider something that would recognize the reality of our election system in a post-Citizens United world.
Right. So I appreciate that. And I will think about other ways to do that. My understanding is the way that it generally happens is that candidates call people that may have maxed out to the candidate to then ask them to donate to the party for $5,000 or up to $10,000. In fact, I think in some parties they can do that twice because some parties have a federal fund and a state fund. So the system already has quite a venue for people to donate too much money. That also just exposes the whole topic of candidates are sometimes considered stronger if they can raise more money for the party than another candidate. And sometimes that leads to preference by some people within the parties as to which candidate they want to get behind because they can raise more money for the party, which is an interesting broader conversation in terms of what's the role of a party, what do parties stand for? Is it about raising more money and therefore who has more power in the system? Or is it about really articulating positions on issues or some of both? I don't think it's actually a binary choice. which actually I think binary choices as a whole is what we're trying to move away from. And that's where some of these provisions maybe limit that. But I do appreciate that. And I will think about if there's another way to do it than opening the floodgates for, and I think the earlier witness testified to this, that, well, what's the disincentive to get 2 or 3 millionaires to run for office to then give the party $150,000 each just for, they could just be on the ballot, even though they're not really running for office. One could do that through the primary, donate a ton of money. I mean, there's doors that get opened, but, and I appreciate the response, the chuckle, but given how important money is in election these days, I could see a couple of people thinking craftily, oh, we could do this through the primary and then they can drop out or whatever, and I've given all that money. So I think it's worth exploring. I just don't know that this is the solution. So I appreciate the effort and I appreciate the topic. Town and county party committees filing with the Secretary of State, I think, is an interesting idea. I'm not necessarily terribly for it or terribly against it. I can just say that in my town of 5,000 odd people, most folks who are engaged in politics kind of know who the active people are in all the different parties. And I think there are other folks who are more quietly involved. They might run a business in town or have relationships with a lot of people across different perspectives and may or may not want to be singled out suddenly as someone in this day and age in politics because Matt, Mr. Byron, is a Democrat. I'm not going to go to his restaurant anymore and we should boycott his restaurant. Now, that's free choice and economic choices that anybody can make. And obviously, as a candidate, you're declared, so you're a bad example in that way. But since you were used as the example earlier, I thought I'd just pile on. But
no, the irony of that is, I mean, I actually have encountered instances where my political engagement and activity as a rep at a Democrat, I have people verbally tell me that they will boycott my business as a result. That's just the world we live in.
It is, but I think for folks who are putting it's hard enough to get people run for office, right? And we have to put out our labels and take positions on issues, and we choose to. That sometimes upset people, and that's part of good discourse. But do we want to have everybody, the 12 or 15 people or 3 people in a local town committee face those potential repercussions as well? Have we gotten to that world around the country? I think much more so than here, but I've seen it creep in over 25 years in different ways that I think is really unfortunate. So I don't think this is necessarily a bad idea. I just think that's something to think about in this process.
Ask you, I'm following that to its logical conclusion. I mean, so if people who stand to be on a committee should be anonymous, because that's really what we're saying is that we're trying to protect people. And I can understand the suggestion that was made this morning about not publishing the addresses of every single person who attends a caucus.
Sure.
But if you're going to stand up, you're an officer. You're a person who's voting. You have power to nominate candidates for office. Like that's a key part of our grassroots democracy in local elections. We wouldn't allow somebody who is like serving as a justice of the peace, for instance, to be anonymous in their role. So that's what's been interesting to me about the status quo for these committees is that you essentially can be a part of multiple committees because there's no way to check whether people are actually organizing with one party or the other. And it's a really key part of how we nominate candidates, and there is power in those local committee members.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting dilemma. I mean, on the one hand, we have to remember parties are not public entities. They're actually private entities. They're private clubs that people choose to join or not and choose to participate in, just like any other organizing activity. They happen to be private clubs that have ramifications in our elections. As far as the nominating aspect, anybody can file a petition with a ballot under any party they want. They don't have to be nominated by a party. The only time that the party is typically nominating in an official sense is sometimes after a primary, if there's nobody up, they will, the district committee, whatever that happens to be, will gather to make that nomination. One would think that again, in a local community or a local district or even an aggregated statewide committee, the process itself pretty well marginalizes the one person or the odd person out there who's got a rather different political perspective than the organization that they're claiming to be a part of. So the impact, I think, is pretty small. Again, I'm not opposed to it. I think you're thinking about really good things and asking good questions, and I was just throwing out one more piece to think about, but that doesn't, I'm not gonna, sink my teeth into that as the be all and end all. I can guarantee you that there are two other provisions, the fusion provision, or three provisions, the fusion provision, the independent filing after the primary is over provision, and the sore loser provision would be the three that I'm probably most concerned about in terms of transparency and opportunity for voters and candidates. So let's go to the cross-party / fusion situation. I know Representative Byron, you asked a Democratic Party witness earlier today if he knew how many. My understanding was that yesterday the Progressive Party person indicated that. I can't remember if he said 60 odd and 70 ran, 61. I don't remember exactly, but I suspect it's in his testimony that he may or may not have handed it out. But I think it's really important to recognize there are 60 officials, 1/3 of the legislature, or if you include a couple statewide, it's a fraction under 1/3 that have multiple party labels. Has that been detrimental to the process? Are people terribly upset? Do you hear an uprising from the general public that they're really angry? I'm asking.
County, absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Yes, just like brand confusion.
Sure.
Like it'd be like you marketing your products from your farm is like conventionally organic. Instead of conventional organic, right?
Except I would actually never do that, but sure.
No, I understand you would.
Nor would any organic farmer.
And I'm making it sort of as we're playing with some semantics.
No, this is helpful.
Yeah, and that is one of the experiences. They don't really understand the political product that's in front of them.
Representative Hango and Representative.
Were you just saying that in reference to Franklin County voters, that they don't understand the differentiation?
So what I want to say is that the issue that came up in the Franklin County Sheriff's race that we're going to hear about from our next witness has absolutely caused a lot of people in Franklin County to question whether it makes sense to have the party nominations go the way that they go. That's why I put this, that is the specific impetus for me putting these couple of provisions out on the table for us to discuss this year. And we'll hear more testimony about that from our next witness.
So that's good to know why you put it out, but I don't think that was the issue in the Franklin County Sheriff's race at all. Party nomination, both parties came out and made statements about the candidate who was on the ballot.
But after he received, and the way he got those nominations is exactly going to be the crux of the next witness's testimony.
I don't agree with that it was a Republican, Democrat, or independent or progressive issue at all. I'll be interested to hear this testimony.
Maybe you might. I really would love to have this conversation after we hear from
Representative Higley.
Two different topics, though. I mean, you're talking about fusion candidates, right?
Right.
You're talking about like
I'm talking about fusion
party
candidates.
affiliations for sheriffs.
But the party affiliation and the dual nomination are all wrapped up in what you're going to hear from our next witness. So I would say if we could put a pin and finish with the lieutenant governor that on this particular conversation, we're going to really dive into this because it's the heart of the matter for me. Representative Higley.
Well, no, just quickly, and I haven't commented on this yet either, but I've been ran as an RD. And I believe in my area, it's because we don't have to declare a party. I'm certainly understanding that the Ds that voted for me out of not a concern for the Democratic Party in a sense, which somebody had mentioned earlier that, that was the case. And I don't think that's the case at all. So I don't have an issue with, an RD designation for sure.
I agree.
And to continue on that vein, I understand that it may create confusion for some, but I also think historically, and again, we're seeing this now, I would say nationally with the Republican Party, that there's this breadth and this split of sort of ideologies within the party that people somehow didn't think existed before, but does now. And the Democratic Party is a big tent party. There are folks that would argue a single label doesn't really tell you within that party's umbrella where that person tends to fall. And when people run with dual labels, may be true in this room, maybe not. I don't know all of Representative Higley's politics. But there are certainly instances where there are folks that may consider themselves a particularly moderate Republican and would want to generate that perception and focus for their voters and would want to run as an RD, or someone in the Democratic spectrum who may want to indicate they are more progressive than more moderate and would want to run as a DP, or that they're like slightly more conservative and would want to run as a DR. I think that's actually a helpful choice for a candidate. And obviously, I don't want to leave it out. There are some that run as PDs. So, you're looking at one of them, of which there are many. There are fewer this time than last time, but that goes up and down. And it gives people a general understanding of the direction that person leans on a wide range of issues. And even within progressives, there are progressives that are unhappy that I run as a PD. And some won't vote for me because of that, because I'm too moderate for them, right? So just to let everybody know, I'm moderate to some people's minds. I've often joked in Western Europe I'd be moderate. But in any case, dual party labels, I think, give more transparency, not less in most instances. And in some places it's active, in other places it's passive because there just isn't even competition. Well, if we want there to not be a dual party label person in a district, I apologize, maybe I'll use you as an example, then find somebody to run on the Democratic ballot. I mean, that's how you solve that problem. Shouldn't be a problem that then impacts voters in other parts of the state who have that transparency of party labels being multiple. Very briefly, gender, race, I think if it could be aggregated, and not individual identified, I think that's valuable information as we're all trying to see, how many of different categories may be elected. But I think, again, the individualization is very challenging and could be very damaging. I do agree with the provision that if you are actively seeking a write-in, I am probably one of the few candidates in the state who has done this many, many times, that having the candidate file it a couple weeks beforehand to alert the clerks and let the clerks know. I can give you a direct example. It was either 2 or 4 years ago. There was a very close write-in ballot. And it then became a news kerfluffle because they had to open the bag of ballots a few days later down, I believe it was in Middletown Springs or a couple towns down that way, because it was actually a 1-vote margin. And my campaign knew. We had people that we knew had taken the progressive ballot or taken the ballot and written them in, and they didn't count them. There were 9 votes in that town. It turned out 7 of them were write-ins for me. It clarified the outcome. So I think having that write-in provision is actually quite good, because it'll save clerks effort and it'll save that kind of confusion after the election. I just didn't understand with sections 14 and 15, if those are also something about write-ins, but more local districts.
Yeah, it's just about the different elections.
Then, yeah, that's what I thought it was. But
one key difference is in the draft of the bill, it allows for the local elections, the consent form can be done all the way up until the closing.
Right. No issue there. I just wasn't sure. So I don't know if I've generated questions and if my time is up anyway.
We are over.
Yeah, and I appreciate you giving me the.
Yeah, no, and we will be working on this bill for at least another week or so. So, if there are quick questions for the Lieutenant Governor now, I'm happy to.
What was the year of that Middletown Springs example, and what exactly was the implications of that problem?
I don't recall. Like I said, it was either 2 or 4 years ago. And the implication would be that there would have been a different person running and creating a 3-way race in the general under the Progressive Party label, as opposed to the fusion way that I was running. And that individual, if I recall, I think it might have been 2020, because we opened up ballot, you didn't need to get signatures to get on the ballot. I had to beat someone whose name was on the ballot who really wasn't, back to controlling who enters a ballot. They were not a historically active progressive in any way. If anything, they were active in other bizarre ways. And so the implication would have been, it would have been a 3-way race. But if there's an organized write-in, you would think that they would, then you want those counted, and that makes it clear that that's the effort. Because you cannot file on 2 ballots. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Are we talking about for governor or lieutenant governor 2 or 4 years ago? Which were you?
2 years, I suppose it's relatively irrelevant, but 2 years ago I was running for governor. 4 years ago I was running for lieutenant governor.
And you're saying 7 votes was going to make the difference as to who your competition was?
7 votes was the difference between my write-in on the progressive ballot for that office, allowing me to run with two-party candidate versus someone else winning the progressive nomination, and therefore that not being the case.
Okay.
And also, Mr. Chair, I know time is limited, so what I'd like to offer is, given 20 whatever years of experience, particularly with a lot of these kinds of provisions, I'm happy to come back or answer questions without sitting in the chair at some other time or meet with anybody.
And I imagine we'll all continue to have these conversations as we consider this important piece of legislation. So thank you for being with us today, Mr. Lieutenant Governor.
I appreciate you giving me the time. Thank you.
One quick Representative Byer.
Sure.
So in your 20+ years of working in and around Fusion candidates, are you aware of any PRs or RPs?
I know that former Senator Vince Aluzzi, as the state's attorney, has run under all 3 parties in the past and would have again had there been a more.
Talking straight RD or DP? Or is the common connecting theme here the D? Coming from one side or the other?
I don't know. I think there may have been one, but I honestly don't know. I'd have to go do some serious digging.
Extremely rare instance.
Sure. Both are, all of them are fairly rare. I mean, DR, DP, they're all, handfuls of, it's a dozen here, a dozen there.
Gotcha.
Representative Chase?
Would the Secretary of State be able to tell us easier?
Perhaps it might take some digging. So
Right.
I think we want to be very specific about what the question we were asking was and why, but
Right.
it's good to think that.
I also don't know that that's critically important, although maybe it is for some reason. I'd love to hear why.
No, I'm just sensing the most common connector within all of these, the alphabet soup is the D.
Well, I think as we think of politics as linear, Ds are more towards the middle of that range. I happen to think politics can be nonlinear over time, but the way our system has worked for a long time, we are sort of stuck in a linear mindset, which frankly, I think leads to partisanship and leads to some of the struggles versus more triangular.
Well, with that,
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us today. So I want to give the committee a very quick break. I know I need to step out for just a moment. So we will get back with our next witness. If folks could try to be back in 5